All right. Well, good to see everybody. Get out of the Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament now, finally, after 4 weeks. But those were great sessions on Noah, Isaiah, and Amos. So because the passage is not all that long, I was able to get the passage and the questions on the same screen so that we don't have to bop back and forth. So would somebody like to go ahead and read that Matthew 22, 34 to 40 passage?
When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets."
Mm-hmm. Is there a word or phrase? Again, I'm not doing question one yet. We'll get there. Is there a word or phrase just that strikes you? You don't need to comment on it. Just is there one that strikes you?
Silenced. The Sadducees didn't have anything else to say.
Greatest.
Love.
Mm-hmm. And law.
For me, it's hang all the law.
Yeah, I was just thinking. Anyone else?
I don't know if this answers your question, but I kind of smiled when a lawyer asked him a question to test him. Even back then, huh?
Yeah. Oh, golly.
I'm going to stop share and reshare a different version and have somebody else read this different version. Somebody else read this one.
Ooh.
When the Pharisees heard how he had bested the Sadducees, they gathered their forces for an assault. One of their religion scholars spoke for them, posing a question they hoped would show him up. "Teacher, which command in God's law is the most important?" Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence." This is the most important, the first on any list. But there is a second to set alongside it. Love others as well as you love yourself. These two commands are pegs. Everything in God's law and the prophets hangs from them.
Did anything different arise from that that version? That's the Message translation, Eugene Peterson's Message translation. Anything different arise out of that one for you?
Silence becomes bested, meaning Jesus won the argument.
Okay.
And then gathering their forces for an assault.
Yes.
It seems much more confrontational.
It's more upfront about the confrontation. The confrontation's there in both versions, but this is really in your face with that confrontation.
Mm-hmm. I like the words passion and prayer.
The last line struck me in the original translation that we read first says, 2 commandments depend on the law and the prophets. And this one says that these 2 commandments are pegs. Everything in God's law and the prophet hangs from them. So this being a metaphor, it's much more poetic and puts a picture in my mind. Come to think of it, did earlier translations of the Bible use metaphors?
Oh, yes. King James is full of it.
hmm
I'm going to go back to the other version here. So just this is kind of an aside and has nothing to do with our other discussion, but I want to just answer sort of a question that Mark asked without asking. There are a number of different theories as to how you translate scripture. One is that you try and be as faithful to the original word as possible. So you'd use language like shekels and denarius and things like that because that's what the original word was. And then there's a theory that says that you would use something that would be a dynamic equivalent. So something that would mean something quite the same, but it was, still one word. So instead of a shekel, you might say $1. And then there's the third one, which is kind of where Peterson is, which is more of a paraphrase, where, a denarius was a day's wage. It might translate into 47 cents, but in a paraphrase, it might, instead of using one of those two things, you might say a day's wage. So there are various ways of doing it, and some are more poetic, some more metaphorical, some more precise, but a lot of times the precise ones aren't very interesting to read. And the New Revised Standard, which is the one that most of us are familiar with these days, is pretty precise, but it's not very poetic. So anyway, so what image then speaks? Mark already said that image of peg, that was a good one. Anybody else have another image?
Well, I was fascinated by the passion, prayer, and intelligence instead of heart, soul, mind, as kind of a way to sort of sharpen that for if you couldn't figure out what you were supposed to do with your heart, this would tell you.
I was thinking the same thing, Mary. I really like that contrast.
Can either one of you speak more to that?
Well, I think, Mary, can you hear me? Sometimes on microphone goes cattywampus. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
We can hear. Yep.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I think like Mary said, though, I think it with only using one word elaborates a little bit more, at least in my mind, in the 21st century, what's meant by, although I like how it's written in your heart, soul, and mind, but I think saying it this way about your passion, prayer, and intelligence, to me, it's much more explicit and less poetic, maybe, to me.
Other images that strike folks. So moving on then, what does it mean to love your neighbor in our current context, and have things changed since, let's say, the 1st of February?
I'll jump in. First thing that came to my mind was mass. I keep hearing from some of my more conservative friends that liberty means I can choose whether to wear a mask or not. And there was someone who wrote in the New York Times gave a great question. Well, if that's the case, then why don't we consider mass like DWI, driving while intoxicated? That maybe you have the right to get in the car, but then you got to harm somebody. So if you don't wear a mask, then you're not necessarily exercising your liberty. You're exercising your perceived right to harm somebody else, which is very unchristian.
Or to put it more positively, you put the mask on not because it protects you, but it protects those that meet you on the the walk or whatever.
Exactly, much
Just
better.
to love your neighbor.
Certainly, to love your neighbor.
I think literally what it meant for Bev and I is we have neighbors on either side of us that are both from India. And both of them have approached us and said, if you need anything or if you need us to go to the store for you, let us know. And these are neighbors who we're friends with, but not that close. And I think we were both touched by the conversation and the sharing that they wanted to do something for us. So that, I think that's what it meant to me.
That's cool.
Well, I think our feeling of our definition of neighbor and neighborhood has expanded significantly in relation to current political climate as well, just in terms of not just our physical neighbors, but our whole community, which can encompass not only our city, but our state, country,
And our world. I mean, the death toll, for the entire world will be over 1 million for sure at this point. And to think of the ways in which some people are forced to live and therefore even worse, forced to die, makes the world pretty large. And our neighbor is everyone.
I see a lot of the Pharisees trying to best people in press conferences and speeches and such.
How so, Deb? Do you want to?
Well, there are some who are trying to make people look bad in their speeches. There are some in their speeches trying to make others look bad, trying to get a foot up. It's more a political thing than a value to the people in the country.
Sure.
Which is the same thing that was going on with the Pharisees. Hey, he knocked off the Sadducees, we'll top him. And that didn't work so well in this reading.
I also thought about the social and political status of the Pharisees in Jewish society. And Deb's comment is interesting because there are leaders in our country who may have the status of Pharisee, but it's this desire to be right. We have to be right and you're wrong. One of the things that just bothers me so much is this: we have the right way, we know the right way, and you don't know the right way. And I'm just not willing to accept that kind of thinking. So, the Pharisees were trying to protect their status in the Roman Empire. And in fact, I think Mary Mead talked about that one Sunday night when Wally and I were going to service in the evening, and that Jesus was a great threat and scary because of what he was saying about a kingdom to come. And they were worried about his being a political force and didn't realize he was not a political force.
Or his political forcefulness would be borne out in a very different way.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it seems like today that the test question for politicians is, what does the phrase Black Lives Matter And people will weigh very carefully what a politician says in answer to that. And I mean, that's just one, but
Right.
not really meant to trick them. It's meant to, reveal, I think, what it is that whoever's listening is trying to follow. But
I agree with that, and I'm going to talk about the love our neighbors.
Please.
We're still very much in, I think, a sense of a cocoon that it's easy to love people like us. It's not easy to give love to people who are not like us. And that is not, it's racial, but it's also in terms of what somebody has done in life, where they are in terms of problems or, whatever. There's this idea of, well, you aren't as good as. And I remember my cousin saying to my aunt one Sunday after church, she was commenting about a man coming in from the street and sitting in the back of the church. And my cousin said, well, Mom, did anybody shake his hand and say hello to him? And I'd been sitting with her and I knew that nobody did that. And so I thought, yeah, that's where the neighbor comes in, doesn't it? And that's still something that I think all of us Christians need to continue to work on. It's the people who are down and out need to have a helping hand. And that can be the hand of a Christian, and you do it because you're a Christian. But the love your neighbor thing is still really hard if they aren't like us and in the same social or the same educational level or whatever. That's a hard row to hoe.
I wonder.
it is both hard, but it is also, in my experience, also very simple, because the more you're with people that seem different, the more they seem like you.
That's
true. So
true.
it isn't hard.
Yeah.
I was struck while you were talking, Irma. One of the things that occurred to me was, I mean, I've long thought that we have moralized so much, that everything becomes a moral issue. So if somebody is down on their luck, we'll use that language. We often moralize it to say that they're if they've done something bad, there's something bad about this, or well, they got sick because they did this.
Yes.
We've begun to turn everything into sort of a moral calculus, or to use biblical language, to turn it into questions of purity and impurity. And
Yes.
we've just changed the language a little bit, but we're still sort of caught up in this concept of purity and impurity. And so the people who are not in agreement with us are impure.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that this morning I was watching St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., and they had the missions person for the National Cathedral give the sermon, and he talked about this program called "What Would You Do?" And I think it's on ABC or something. I found it on YouTube, and I watched an episode this morning. Almost brought me to tears. And they just it's kind of like Candid Camera, but they have these two actors. One guy was bagging groceries, and another guy comes up to him and says, "Oh, hey, I know you. We used to work together." And this guy's in a nice suit, and he starts making fun of the guy who's bagging groceries. And then you see the response of people who are in the supermarket, and they have a hidden camera or something. And then people start standing up for the guy who's bagging groceries, saying, "Hey, you shouldn't be rude to that person." And it was really interesting. And the guy's like, "Well, why can't I be rude to that person? I'm successful, he's not." And it was just really interesting to see just all different people. They kept on doing this, I don't know, case study or this this circumstance where this bagger was kept on getting confronted by an old colleague of his, and it was really neat to see people stand up for him and do what's right, and they had to kind of break out sometimes out of their frozenness, or they didn't want to go into a confrontation. But a lot of them eventually they just had to say something and say, hey, you shouldn't be rude to people. Or one lady said, hey, I'm going to give that bagger a job because he's nice, not you who's being rude to other people. So it was just a great program.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
So moving along here, how do you think the lawyer felt about Jesus's answer? I think that's a great question.
How would the lawyer feel?
Well, most of us know that he pulled the "you shall love your neighbor as yourself" out of obscurity. In Leviticus, it's there, but it doesn't have the prominence of the second most important thing. And I'm sure the lawyer was astounded by that. And
Yeah,
probably caused him to be quiet while he thought about it.
that sort of struck me because as I'm trying to remember my Hebrew Bible, and I think you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind. That's from the Hebrew Shema. It's like the most important prayer in the Hebrew. And so he's turning this canon back on the lawyer and saying, it's so obvious. This is the most important prayer in all of Judaism. You should, know this, is kind of how I'm reading it this morning.
Well, I also think Jesus saying all the laws are pegged on these two. Because when you think about the law as it's handed out in Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus, Deuteronomy, forgot about that one, they are very much based on loving God and acting like you love God and with everything in your being, so you wouldn't commit murder and all the things that are listed. But and the neighbor was one of the problems for the children of Israel, because they kept getting mad at Moses and Aaron. I didn't want to do this. And they certainly couldn't show love for each other. And that wasn't acceptable. So I think you're right. Silence was probably what happened. But boy, that's an important statement, that all law is based on those two things.
Which two things?
Loving God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And not only that, but he also, in the story of the Samaritan, described who the neighbor was. And
Exactly.
It was anybody.
Yeah, I was thinking of that too.
Other thoughts about how the lawyer might have taken that?
Maybe resentment. How can he do that kind of thing to me?
I wonder if he thought about the hierarchy of how the laws flow through society. It says the 2 commandments hang on all the law. So it's not like there's discrete, separate laws that need to be studied and followed, that there's a guiding principle here. And I just wonder if at that time the prophecies were thinking of that in that regard, rather than discrete.
Mary?
I believe at that time, the schools, they had shulas or whatever for training up priests, and they were already in that argument form of, and I believe, and I can't think of the name of the one, it was the one that was kinder of the two schools, but I think he had already come to this conclusion as well. So it might not have been totally by surprise that this occurred, but
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, that the schools, the two primary schools were Hillel and Shammai.
that's right.
And I think Hillel was asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he said something along these lines. And he said, everything else is just commentary.
Yeah.
Or can you recite the law on one leg and or standing on one foot? And so he did, and he said this, and he said everything else is commentary. So I think that we get hung up in a lot of this. Yeah, and so these debates that are reflected here in the Gospels are debates that were going on outside the context of the Gospels as well. I mean, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were at each other's throats all the time.
Yeah.
So Jesus played on that a couple of times. I remember when I was doing my doctorate, somebody said, well, when you go into your doctoral defense, just remember that if things get tough, find something that two of the faculty will disagree on, and then they'll argue with one another until the end of the meeting.
Did it work?
I didn't have to, but I was in the back of my mind.
Great advice, because
Yep.
I've been in that position. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm thinking about this. You have to wonder, because the gospel stories show Jesus over and over again, really pointing out to his questioners how silly they are.
Mhm.
I mean, and sometimes he says, how slow of heart you are. You guys, are you really dense? I mean, he says that to his disciples so often. So you got to wonder, is the lawyer thinking, oh, he got me. I thought I had the upper hand here, but no. So is he frustrated?
Why is he saying that?
Yeah, so it's just, I don't know. Is he frustrated? Made to feel silly? Did he want to slink away? Oh, shoot, that was a stupid question. I should have known in advance what he was going to say.
Yeah, no. I mean, if he's calling them stupid, he's feeling that no one's hearing him.
Well, that could be.
It also places an equality sign between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They both got bested.
Yeah.
It's not the sort of besting that would endear him to them either.
That would probably be one of the many reasons that he wound up on the cross, huh?
So what's this passage saying to us, either as individuals or to Good Shepherd right now?
I think that when we're looking at how we want to move forward, that maybe we ought to keep these two commandments in mind as the foundation of whatever we do. But it probably would be, but I think to be more explicit about it in the way that we go about crafting what we do and how we communicate about it.
I think simply it says a rule of life for me.
Okay. There's another version, maybe it's Luke's version of this, where there's a fourth thing that's added: love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. That takes it all. That from my mind, my thinking, moves it from beyond sort of this internal engagement to something that actually has real world implications. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. That there's more that about to this than is just me. That it has real world implications.
Mhm.
So take the focus off oneself and spread it to loving God and loving your neighbor.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think, certainly the challenge following the law is something that one does individually, but it has real world implications. And so what does it mean to love God with heart, soul, and mind, and neighbor as self? It means that you do something. This isn't just an internalized attitudinal shift. It's something that has feet.
Thank you.
That's how I'm reading it anyway.
I understand.
So I'm just reading this and thinking of the service this morning, and to me, I keep getting this feeling that the church is foundational. The church is the church. No matter what we're doing to do the church right now, it's the church. And you just go back to your most powerful, important, basic prayer of loving God first and extending that love to your neighbor and your community. And we have to be told this week after week, but it's all foundational. And if we hold those closely in our hearts, the law and the prayer in our hearts, we're doing church.
It also doesn't say you should love your neighbor who's nice as yourself. It says you'll love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this time of great divisiveness, that's sometimes really hard to do. And maybe the harder comment, loving God is relatively easy compared to loving someone who's telling you you're a fool.
There is something else too. Some people have trouble loving themselves, so you've got to deal with that as well.
Yeah, to your point, Deb, I think that was a little bit of what I was trying to say to Diane Bausch, is that it's really easy for many of us to sit in our, to use other language from the Gospels, to sit in your small room, your closet, and be devout, to love God with heart, soul, and mind in your own little place. But the second piece of that is that it really does mean that you move outside and you do this neighbor thing. And yeah, certainly it's hard to love a neighbor who's a jerk. Especially since sometimes you want to maintain good relationships with those neighbors who are jerks because they live next door or something like that.
Self-protection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you start arguing over who's going to fix the fence.
And what about the neighbor who you don't see, who you don't live next to, but is still a part of your community, who lives in the other part of town or in another state or another country or whatever? These are still our neighbors. And how do we reach out and express that love towards that greater community outside our own little circle?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and how do we love our neighbor who isn't being neighborly? They're not treating others with love and respect. How do we love them? That's always a hard one for me.
Yep.
I've discovered that you know, in as I was saying, my church seems to be my cul-de-sac these days, but more and more people have just come to sort of sit on the porch and talk. And we have a long porch so we can keep the distance. It's really kind of interesting what they want to talk about, and how they are, you know, feeling about what's going on around them. And so the gift of loving, in my case, is simply listening. But it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think the gift of giving is often listening.
Yeah.
And not judging. Just listening is so crucial. Just listening.
And accepting that they have a right to their feelings, that they have a right to express their feelings, even though they may not be the same as yours, or that you may not agree with their feelings or their beliefs, be it religious or political or social or whatever.
True, very true.
Other comments, I mean, especially as to what is this saying to Good Shepherd? I think Becky sort of started going down that road, but we've veered more personally or more globally, maybe, rather than focused into what does this say to Good Shepherd.
Well, in that regard, Gary, going back to the fourth element that you mentioned, which was, where is it now? With your whole heart, your soul, and your mind. Then you added
Strength.
Strength, yes. And last year, some of us in the men's group did a survey to help us discern what our strengths were. And all that was leading to, you know, how could we participate in some form of volunteerism that are based on these strengths. So I see that as being the connection of Good Shepherd, is how can we contribute to the community through the strengths that we have. And everybody has different skills or interests.
I also think that there are those who really are anxious to get back into the building. The building is an important part of church for them. And there are those of us who know we probably won't be in that building for quite some time. And, you know, my fear has always been that church leaves me behind. And so I think it's important also for me to realize that it's important for my neighbor to have that physical presence of being in the church. So I think that comes into play for Good Shepherd, is keeping everyone a neighbor.
Good, Deb, thank you.
And of course, I think, you know, which is so obvious, but it perhaps needs saying, Good Shepherd keeps reminding us that this is the heart of everything that we do. And if we don't do this every Sunday, we're likely to forget. So there's that role for Good Shepherd, whether we do it on Zoom or in a building or both.
Yeah, from Good Shepherd's standpoint, I think to me, it's all about, you know, the love we have for each other, and then also this being a family. Tying into what Mary just said, we went, Bev and I, primarily myself, went out and did a lot of Faith Alive weekends in other churches, and I always felt that I had a strength there because I could feel the love and the family from Good Shepherd, and that gave me the strength to go out and comfortably do those things.
I agree.
Well, this goes back, I think, to one of the things that Mark was saying, and I think maybe it's a place to, I don't want to cut us off immediately here, but a place for us to engage in some sort of soul searching is if we look back and think about what are the things that Good Shepherd does well, or the things that we really value. And we value community. We've already talked about that. We've talked about how Good Shepherd values worship. We've talked about how Good Shepherd values outreach, just to use those three. How do we use those values? How do those translate into loving our neighbor? How do we love our neighbor? How do we love our neighbor through our community? How do we love? I mean, it's easy to talk about loving your neighbor through outreach, but all those ways, what is the way of translating those ways that we love God, community, worship, all that? How do we translate that into love for neighbor? I don't have a preset answer. Just a ponderable.
Well, I think church continues to strengthen us to do what we do, whatever it is, outside. We go to church in order to get strong again, or to, be in prayerful relationship with God for that which didn't go well, or whatever, so that we can go back out and do more. And so that's my answer.
Anyone else? Any final words for us? It's closing in on 11.
Just remembering that they are commandments, and they are, aren't they? To love thy neighbor and love God.
Okay.
And it's a reminder too.
Anyone else? Well, if not, thank you all. Look forward to seeing you at various points in time over the next week and next Sunday.